Chapter 81. Maisie looked at the three rugrats on the ground exhaustedly, chuckled, and said, "You three really do know how to make things difficult for me." Daisy was the first one to respond. "Mommy, we just want you to get along well with Daddy." Colton took over the conversation immediately. "Yes, Mommy, look at us, we don't have a daddy, and we're so pitiful." Waylon did not know what to say, so he just nodded his head anyway. "I'm going to wash my face." Maisie walked straight to the restroom. Daisy scratched her head. "Mommy doesn't seem to have slept well." Colton nodded. "I know, right? Mommy has dark circles under her eyes." The three rugrats looked at Nolan, who was still sleeping, and crept close to him. Colton could not help but ask, "Why is Daddy still not awake?" Daisy and Waylon stared at Nolan for a long time. Waylon then noticed something was wrong and stretched out his hand to touch his forehead. "Daddy seems to be having a fever." Colton was startled. "Could it be because we made Daddy soak himself in ice water last night?" The two little boys suddenly felt a little guilty. Sure enough, they were the ones who had made their father sick. Maisie picked up the thermometer and looked at 102 degrees Fahrenheit shown on the reading scale. "This man actually has a high fever." Daisy looked worried. "Mommy, Daddy has a high fever. Will he die of illness?" She had heard that people who were sick could die, so she was very scared. Waylon comforted her. "No, it's just like the fever and cold that we usually have, we only need to give Daddy some fever reducers." "Mommy, here's the medicine." Colton ran in at that moment with some fever-reducing medicine that was available at home. Maisie grabbed the medicine in his hand, picked up a glass of warm water that Daisy brought in, and hesitated for a split second all of a sudden as she stared at the man who was lying on the bed. "How can I get this into his body?" Waylon propped his chin. "They usually feed medicine using mouth-to-mouth in dramas." "Waylon, you're not allowed to watch those misleading dramas in the future." Maisie was about to be stimulated to death. "Just what kind of kid did I give birth to?" Maisie shoved the medicine into Nolan's mouth and chugged it down with water. Nolan choked, coughed, and woke up immediately even though he was still soundly asleep a second ago. The three rugrats looked at him with sympathy that was so miserable. Seeing that he had awakened, Maisie said, "I've given you fever-reducing medicine, now that you're awake, go back home at this instant." Nolan took a glance at her but then laid back down. "I'm a patient, and I need a good rest." "You." Daisy pouted. "Mommy, Daddy is already sick, how can you drive him away?" Colton seconded. "Yes, Daddy may be robbed by beggars if he were to pass out on the road." Maisie was rendered speechless. Although Nolan was closing his eyes and resting, he was happy to hear that the children were defending him. At least, he could stay here for now. "My reputation is of my least concern at this moment." After Maisie went to work, Nolan woke up after another hour of sleep. After taking the fever medicine, his head did not feel as groggy as it was in the morning. He walked to the living room and saw Waylon cooking something in the kitchen. Although the tiny figure was standing on the stool, he did everything very skillfully. "Daddy, has your fever gone down?" Daisy toddled up to Nolan. Seeing that she was worried about him, Nolan rubbed her little head. "Yeah, I'm feeling better already. Can Waylon cook?" "Don't underestimate our eldest brother. Although he is very young, he can do everything. He's the one who takes care of us when Mommy is too busy to take care of us." Daisy could not help but tout her brother proudly. Nolan frowned. "She's too busy to take care of the kids? Mommy needs to raise the three of us alone. Mommy won't be able to make money to support us if she takes care of us all the time." Waylon walked to the table with breakfast. Chapter 82. Nolan's eyes were drooping. "So this is why these two kids go out there to work with an entertainment company?" Seeing that Waylon was going to make another one, Nolan raised his hand and rubbed his head. "It's okay, leave the rest to Daddy." Waylon looked at him suspiciously. Daddy, do you know how to cook? The dignified heir of the Goldmans, the famous Mr. Goldman of Bassburg, there should not be a lot of chance for him to be exposed to such skills. Of course. Nolan put on an apron and entered the kitchen. Daisy and Wayland stared at his figure, and both of them were looking forward to the meal as a hint of expectation was flashing across their eyes. Colton smelled the fragrance and ran downstairs in his doll slippers. Wayland, are you making breakfast? Seeing his siblings sitting and waiting at the dining table, he looked toward the kitchen, and his eyes widened. It turns out Daddy was the one who's making breakfast today. Nolan brought the breakfast to the table, and the three Rugrats exclaimed, "Wow." Colton blinked as he looked at Nolan. "Daddy, you can actually cook." Nolan smiled. "Isn't it a simple thing to do?" "It's delicious. Daddy's cooking is delicious." Daisy could not wait and had already started digging in. She then nodded happily after trying her father's breakfast. Nolan looked at his watch. Quincy should be here at any minute. Sure enough, the doorbell rang, and Nolan got up to open the door. Quincy had brought along 2 bags of clothes and handed them to him. He did not expect Nolan to be able to stay here last night. The progression is fast. After seeing the 3 Rugrats in the house, he was frozen in place. Mr. Goldman, Am I seeing things? He rubbed his eyes. Why am I looking at 2 Waylands? They're triplets, Nolan answered indifferently. Quincy was shocked. She didn't just give birth to 2 in one go, but 3, damn, that's quite an achievement. Thinking of something, Quincy said, by the way. Mr. Goldman Sr. asked you to find a time to bring these 2 children back to see him. You should know that Mr. Goldman Sr. has been thinking about them ever since he saw them. Now that there are 3, you should bring all 3 of them back. Mr. Goldman Sr. will definitely be delighted. Are you talking to him again? Nolan glared at him. Quincy slapped his mouth lightly and responded aggrievedly. Mr. Goldman Sr. called and asked me about the situation of the 2 children. I might have told him a thing or 2. Okay. There's nothing else that requires your attention here, Nolan said while shutting the door. Quincy stood on the other side of the door with a perplexed expression. So, does Mr. Goldman plan to stay at someone else's house for the rest of his life? Z. Didn't you sleep well last night? Looking at the drowsiness that appeared on Maisie's face from time to time, Kennedy brought her a cup of coffee. You should treat yourself to a cup of coffee and freshen yourself up. Thank you, Uncle Kennedy. Maisie smiled as she took a sip of hot coffee. Damn it. If I hadn't been watching the man all night to prevent him from doing anything to me last night, I would have had a good night's sleep. This is all thanks to the 3 rascals back home. I wonder if Nolan has left. Her brows creased as she thought about that, but while she was thinking so, there were some commotions outside. She raised her head and saw her father charging into the room with a gloomy expression regardless of the staff members' attempts to stop him. Stephen then said solemnly, "You really are here." After Stephen saw Kennedy, his expression turned even sullener. "Mr. Vanderbilt, if you're here to persuade me to return to Vena, then my answer is still the same, I won't go back." Maisie put down the coffee mug in her hand. What other intention could her father have besides this? It seems that Layla's and her daughter are still unwilling to give up. However, Stephen pointed at her. I'll ask you just this once, do you have a child with Mr. Goldman? Chapter 83. Maisie was startled, and her expression turned sulky. Stephen's words just so happened to surprise Kennedy, who looked at Maisie and also the employee who was still standing outside the door wondering what to do. Z. I've always felt sorry for you because of your mother's affairs, so I've always wanted you to inherit Vena jewelry. But it seems that what you did 6 years ago still wasn't enough, and you're actually getting involved with Mr. Goldman now. Do you even know how to spell the word shame? Mr. Goldman is your elder sister, Willie's boyfriend. Stephen was completely disappointed in her. He had even witnessed what the 2 of them were doing in the office the other day, so how could he believe that his daughter was innocent? facing her father's accusation. Maisie clenched her hands tightly. Are you lecturing me about shame? Then why didn't you tell Layla that she's a shameless whore when she climbed onto your bed? You shut up. Stephen shouted sharply. The matter between your mother and me has nothing to do with Layla. The smile on Maisie's face still looked extremely ironic. It has nothing to do with that, Dad. You really do know how to defend Layla? You don't even understand what happened between your mother and me. Stephen gnashed his teeth. Yes, I might not understand that. But have you ever tried to understand me? Maisie stood up, and her hands that had clenched into fists were trembling vigorously. Do you think I snatched Willow's boyfriend? Great, then I shall disclose it to you today. Those kids are indeed Nolan's children. Maisie Vanderbilt. You. They're 5 years old this year, so if you take the 1 year of pregnancy into account, it should have happened 6 years ago, right? A look of surprise flashed through Stephen's eyes, and the thing that he wanted to say was stuck in his throat. Maisie sneered coldly. You've always believed what Layla and Willow said. Only you will believe in anything that comes out of their mouth, but you've never believed in a word that I said. Sometimes I don't even know if I'm your biological daughter. These words made Stephen's expression turn sullen. Bullshit, what nonsense are you talking about? But am I wrong? Maisie asked in reply. You're more partial to Willow than me. It's just like I'm an outsider in the family, the illegitimate daughter of the Vanderbilts. Oh, no, pardon me. I don't even think that I live up to the title of an illegitimate daughter. Stephen's shoulders trembled as his eyes dimmed. Taking everything into account, I should thank Willow too, if she hadn't set me up and caused me to lose my chastity 6 years ago. I wouldn't know that I actually slept with the famous and prestigious Mr. Goldman of Zlokova. Looking at Stephen's mixed and complicated expressions, Maisie continued. So if we were to apply your statement to this incident and trace it back to 6 years ago, am I the person who snatched Willow's man? Or is she the whore who stole mine? The staff member who was witnessing all these outside the door felt as if his mind was about to explode from the inside out due to the huge amount of information that he obtained in such a short amount of time. However, sensing that someone was approaching, the staff member was so shocked that his shoulders trembled when he turned his head. Mr. Goldman. It could be said that Nolan's appearance at this moment was very coincidental, and it just so happened that he had heard what Maisie just said. I'm her man, huh? When Maisie saw him appear outside the door, the confidence that she was showing through her expression crumbled in an instant. What the fuck? Stephen did not expect Nolan to appear at this time, and his emotions became even more complicated. Mr. Vanderbilt. I never seem to have personally admitted that Willow's my girlfriend, have I? Nolan walked by Stephen, stopped right beside him, and clarified unconcernedly. Stephen was speechless for a while. Indeed, he had never heard Nolan personally admit that Willow was his girlfriend. He had only heard it from Layla and Willow. Chapter 84. Willow has nothing to do with me. She lied to me for 6 years and even had the guts to drug me last night. Mr. Vanderbilt, how do you plan to settle this account for your daughter? Maisie was stunned. Did Willow drug him last night? No wonder he was so anxious and violent last night. I almost became the victim of that scheme. Stephen's expression changed slightly. How would Willie? It doesn't matter if you don't want to resolve it yourself. But please be reminded that the outcome will be different when I go to her personally. The sentence was an obvious threat. Stephen's expression became one of embarrassment, but he could not say anything else. If it truly is Willie's fault, I'll definitely teach her a lesson when I get back home. Nolan's tone sounded indifferent. I don't want to listen to the word if. Stephen knew that Nolan was a man who would do anything. He really would not let Willow go if he did not provide him with an explanation. He responded and pleaded, okay, I'll give you an explanation after this, Mr. Goldman, so please show Willie some mercy and let this slide this time around. Upon hearing that Stephen was still defending Willow at this moment, a touch of self-deprecation flashed across Maisie's eyes. If I were to be the one being discussed now, would he beg others to let me go? Stephen left the office, and Kennedy and the others also left because Nolan was there. After realizing that she and Nolan were the only two people left in the office, Maisie's attitude was still as unconcerned as always. Mr. Goldman, you didn't even show your former girlfriend any mercy. I wonder if the people who don't know the details of this incident will think of you as a man who abandoned his previous lover just because he's found a new one. As soon as she said that, Nolan walked up to her and lifted her chin. Now that things have turned out like this, don't you think you have to bear some of the responsibility? Maisie was dumbfounded for a split second. What responsibility do I have to bear? His tone sounded faint. Willow wouldn't have gotten the opportunity to take advantage of the incident if you didn't run away 6 years ago, and if all that hadn't happened, she wouldn't even be a thing today. If he were to have found out that Maisie was the woman from that night when he went to the Vanderbilt Manor 6 years ago, the woman who had been staying by his side all this while would not be Willow. Maisie pushed his hand away and smirked. That being said, are you saying that you blame me for providing her with the opportunity? But weren't you a rather content man when you were defending her? Nolan's eyes dimmed slightly while his lips pressed into a cold line. Does she care about those instances in which I misunderstood her while defending Willow? Nolan could understand her mindset thinking of this, and the corners of his lips were slightly raised. I can also defend you. Hee. I don't need that. Maisie pushed him away and was about to leave. Nolan turned around and hugged her from behind. Maisie's expression changed slightly as she tried to pry his hand open. Nolan Goldman, what are you doing? The arms that were wrapped around her waist were tight, and the man lowered his head and pressed his lips against her auricle. Bring the children and move in with me. Impossible. Maisie's expression was distorted. He wants me to move in with him, keep dreaming, Maisie Vanderbilt. Nolan rubbed her lips with his fingers. If you want me to persuade you, I don't mind trying another way. He then kissed her neck with his cold lips. Maisie shrugged in fright. Wait. At least give me a few days to think about it. Nolan let her go, squinted his eyes, and gave off a grin. I'll only give you 3 days. After Nolan left with satisfaction, Maisie could not help but clench her hands into fists, her eyes cold. Apart from that night from 6 years ago and that the kids were his, she had no feelings for this man. I must admit that Nolan isn't only breathtakingly attractive, regal, and elegant looking, but he's also a well-known, powerful, and influential aristocrat in Zlokova. The various conditions that he possesses make him the ideal partner in the eyes of many celebrities and socialites. But Dad's extramarital affair has created a barrier in my heart ever since I was a kid. Chapter 85. Besides, how could a man who owns ample money and power like him be a man who leads a stable life? Plus, even if he thought Willow was the woman from 6 years ago, something must have happened between Willow and him during the time they were together. I don't want to have anything to do with the man that Willow has touched, absolutely not. At the Vanderbilt Manor, Stephen's palm landed on Willow's cheek. Layla was frightened by the slap. She stepped forward immediately and pulled Stephen away from Willow. Dear. Why did you slap Willie? Why did I slap her? Stephen pointed at Willow angrily. Why don't you ask her yourself? She had the balls to drug Mr. Goldman. Do you think she can still stand here unscathed if I don't give Mr. Goldman an explanation? Layla panicked instantly and looked at Willow. Willie, you've drugged Mr. Goldman. Willow clutched her cheek, bit her lip firmly, and did not utter a single word. Damn it, I was already on the verge of succeeding. Who's the shitsack that has ruined my plan? Fuck. How could this happen? Willie. Don't touch me. Willow flung her mother's hand away, her eyes bloodshot. Everything has gone sour because of that bitch Maisie. She snatched Nolan from me. Nolan was obviously mine. Layla's expression turned pale instantly. She wanted to stop Stephen, but it was already too late. Stephen had already slapped Willow again. It was so harsh that she collapsed on the floor. I dare you to say that again. Willow had never suffered such grievances in her life. So tears started welling up in her eyes as she gnashed her teeth bitterly. I didn't say anything wrong, Maisie, that bitch, she's the one who snatched Nolan from me. Seeing that Stephen had lifted his hand once again, Willow roared, come on. You'd better beat me to death right here right now. Anyway, I'm just the illegitimate daughter, and everyone in this world can just tread on me however they want. If all of you know only how to force me at this moment, then I should just die. She got up and ran upstairs. The door of her room was slammed shut. Willie. Layla was worried that Willow would do something stupid, so she dashed to Willow's room and knocked on the door. Stephen sat down on the couch in a daze. How could this happen? How could it turn out like this? Willie. Please open the door, Willie. Layla knocked on the door and heard no response, so she rammed the door down. She was not seen in the bedroom, so Layla ran to the bathroom and found out that Willow had slit her wrist open. At the administrative office, you rascal, if it weren't for Quincy. Until when would you want to hide the news from me? Mr. Goldman Sr. was so furious in the video call on the screen that he almost took out his crutches from the side. Nolan crossed his legs, leaned on the couch, and looked at him, his tone sounding indifferent. I planned to wait until the time was right to tell you about it. Wait until the time is right? Mr. Goldman Sr. got even more irked. I would have died by then, but I don't have to count on you anymore, as I have a grandson and a granddaughter now. That's more than enough. It's 2 grandsons and a granddaughter. Nolan corrected him unconcernedly. Mr. Goldman Sr. was taken aback. His joy could not be concealed on his face. Ha ha ha, kiddo, you're indeed awesome. Thinking of something, Mr. Goldman Sr. then looked at him. Who's the children's mother? Bring her here, and let me take a good look at her some other time. I'm not asking for a lot, as long as she comes from an honorable family and is well-mannered. After all, he was so ecstatic that she had given birth to 2 grandsons and 1 granddaughter for the Goldmans. Nolan's eyes flickered. We'll find time to pay you a visit. Humph, I'll have to wait for too long before you can manage to find the time. I'll return to Bassburg to check her out by myself sometime soon. Mr. Goldman Sr. turned off the computer. Nolan closed the lid of the laptop when the screen went black. Quincy smiled at the same time. I bet Mr. Goldman Sr. must be delighted. Chapter 86. Nolan ignored Quincy, acting as if he had been drugged by that woman and was addicted to her. It had only been half a day, and he already could not wait to see her. Sure enough, I did give her 3 days to think about my offer, but it's still too long, at Beach Villa. When eating dinner, Maisie held the spaghetti on the plate with her fork but had no appetite at all. She raised her eyes and looked to the front from time to time and felt like her children had been abducted. Tisk, Nolan is really too shameless for me to handle. He's the one who said he'll give me some time to think about it, but he will never miss the chance to come to my place for dinner. Daisy was sitting on her father's lap. The feeling of being fed by her father was really amazing. Of course, he did not only pamper Daisy. He would fetch Waylon and Colton some dishes from time to time. Waylon's reaction was not as excited as that of Colton's and Daisy's, which at least provided Maisie with a little sense of comfort. Daddy, you should eat more. Try some of Mommy's buffalo chicken wings. Daisy placed a piece of chicken wings onto Nolan's plate. Maisie's eyelids twitched. Daisy, he has arms and hands, he can grab the dishes by himself. Are you jealous, Mommy? Seeing that Daisy looked extremely happy. Maisie almost bent the fork in her hand. Nolan raised his eyebrows and rubbed Daisy's hair. Well, your mother might really be jealous. Maisie lowered her head to eat, not wanting to say another word. Nolan placed 1 chicken wing onto her plate. Don't worry. I'll pamper you too. I shouldn't give my pretty little wife the cold shoulder just because of the kids, By the way, the phrase pretty little wife is indeed appropriate. She's in good shape, young, gorgeous looking, and talented. She would pass with flying colors if there were to be an audition in search of a woman who could match my status. But this pretty little wife is really a pain in the ass. She can only be looked at but can't be touched. What should I do about that? If Maisie were to know what Nolan was thinking at the moment, the bowl in her hand might most probably end up on his face. She looked at the chicken wing that he had placed on her plate, picked it up immediately, and put it on Waylon's plate. Your father said he would still pamper you. So eat more. Waylon glanced at Nolan, whose expression turned slightly gloomy, and calmly put the chicken wing into Colton's bowl. He'll pamper you, eat another one. Colton was rendered speechless. When Daisy saw this, she felt that it was not right. She still had to create more opportunities for her father. She turned her head and asked, Daddy, could you stay here tonight? Maisie gnashed her teeth. Daisy, our house is not big enough to accommodate such a big shot. He is not a big shot, he is Daddy. Daisy sounded pitiful. Nolan looked down at the girl sitting in his arms who had arranged everything for him, and the corners of his lips were lifted slightly. She's definitely my biological daughter. Maisie mentioned the obvious, we don't have an extra bed at home. Colton looked up at her. Your bed is so big, you could even sleep with Daddy last night. Maisie put down her silverware and stood up. The three Rugrats shivered out of fear. She went into her room angrily, took a quilt and pillow out, threw them directly on the couch, turned around, and went back to her room without saying a word. Bam! The door was slammed shut. Daisy raised her head and looked at the person above her head. Daddy, we can only help you up till this point. At this time, Waylon took out a key and handed it to Nolan. I've secretly forged a spare key for Mommy's room. Nolan was surprised. This assist has won my heart. The other two Rugrats were also amazed. Waylon's action is definitely making him the MVP. Thinking about the man in the house, Maisie did not even want to take a shower. She locked the door behind her as soon as she returned to the room. She had even brought along the spare keys from the rooms of the three Rugrats. She leaned behind the door, rubbing her forehead to soothe her headache. Chapter 87. Riley sent her a text message. It was obvious that the three Rugrats had leaked the secret to her. That was how she knew about Nolan's plan to stay here for the night. Sensing the expectations that Riley showed through her message, she replied. What's on that filthy mind of yours? Bags can only be allowed to sleep on the couch. She then turned her cell phone off. All I can do now is to avoid him for as long as possible. A tall figure came to the edge of the bed in the middle of the night. He slowly sat down and looked at the woman who was sleeping soundly on the bed. He propped his hands against the bed, leaned over, and covered her lips with his own lips. Maisie's eyelashes trembled, and she raised her hand and waved gently. Ugh, stop. Her languid and coquettish voice was accompanied by a hint of nasal resonance. She also frowned slightly as if he was disturbing her sweet dreams. Nolan stared at her unsuspecting appearance, and a touch of tenderness flashed across his eyes. He then rubbed the corners of her lips with his fingertips. Maisie, I'll make you accept me willingly. The next morning, Maisie opened her eyes and woke up, wondering how she had gotten to sleep so soundly and comfortably last night. Sure enough, it's because the bag wasn't there. She got up and walked to the door. The door was still locked. It's fortunate that all the spare keys are with me. She walked to the living room in her nightdress, stretched comfortably, and as soon as she turned her head, she saw the three Rugrats sitting at the dining table, staring at her. Nolan walked out of the kitchen with breakfast at that moment and looked at her too. Awakened already? Maisie froze in place. She almost forgot that this man had stayed here last night. Mommy, you're up. Daddy has made breakfast for us. Colton waved his tiny hand at her. Maisie couldn't believe her eyes. What's with the sensation of déjà vu that I'm feeling? What's going on? No, I must be hallucinating. Maisie turned around and walked back to her room. After seeing her mother get into her room, Daisy asked Nolan softly, "Daddy, did you secretly sleep in Mommy's room last night?" Nolan squinted his eyes and placed his index finger in front of his lips, giving off a shushing motion. Daisy nodded with brilliant eyes. Nolan had not spent much time on the couch last night but slept with his pretty little wife for 5 hours. He really did sleep very soundly when she was by his side. Fortunately, he had set the vibrating alarm on his watch to wake him up, left her room before she woke up, and locked the door with his spare key. After Maisie freshened herself up and changed into her clothes, she walked out of the room again. Yes, this is truly not an illusion. Daddy and Mommy, Waylon, and I are heading to the company. Miss Angela is here to pick us up already. Bye. Daisy took a small backpack with her and went out with Waylon. Colton jumped off the chair and walked to Maisie. Mommy, I need to go to the music academy today too. Will you and Daddy send me off? Okay, when Uncle Quincy drives the car here. Your mother and I will bring you to the college. Nolan did not care whether Maisie agreed to the plan or not and promised Colton on her behalf. Colton nodded and ran upstairs to grab his school bag. Maisie gradually returned to her senses and bumped into Nolan as soon as she turned around. She then raised her head. You. Finish your breakfast first, Colton, and I will be waiting for you in the car. Nolan really took Colton out first when Colton came back downstairs. Maisie turned her head and looked at the breakfast on the table. He even prepared my share, Anne. How could such an egoistic man make such a delicate and loving breakfast, not to mention, it's made by the legendary Mr. Goldman of the Goldmans. Colton and Nolan waited in the car for 15 minutes, only to see Maisie walking out of the house. Colton slid the window of the front passenger seat. Mommy, hurry up. Chapter 88. Maisie, who originally wanted to get into the front passenger seat, was rendered speechless. As soon as she sat down in the rear passenger seat, Quincy turned to look at her and gave her a wide smile. Good morning, Mrs. Goldman. Maisie gnashed her teeth. Mrs. Goldman, you're as drive. She would have completed the impertinent sentence if it weren't for Colton's presence. Quincy pouted his lips. Ms. Vanderbilt is rather hot-tempered. Mr. Goldman will have a lot to bear in the future. Nolan turned around and glanced at her. Maisie's fashion sense had always been good. She was wearing a professional suit, but she managed to bring out a unique fashionable style. It seemed monotonous to wear a pure black basic blouse and a buttonless black patterned suit. But the blue-black gradient and the irregular lace split skirt contrasted sharply with the burgundy heels. It made the overall look not only less monotonous, but also more fashionable. And the earrings that were in the same color as the heels had also become a dazzling embellishment. Maisie saw the man beside her kept staring at her with his scorching eyes and felt a little uncomfortable sitting down. When the extremely conspicuous Maybach stopped at the main entrance of the Royal Academy of Music of Zlokova, it attracted the attention of a lot of people. Some parents who sent their children to the academy recognized the owner of the car's license plate number at a glance. Isn't that Mr. Goldman's car? Oh yeah. The owner of Basberg's stratospherically priced 9,999 plate number could only be Mr. Goldman. Not only that, but they also knew that the number plates of the silver Rolls-Royce and the limited edition Pagani sports car that Mr. Goldman owned also cost a fortune. It's our luck to be able to witness it in person today. Looking at the gazes that came from outside the car window, Maisie rubbed her forehead. Being with this man is a flashy thing to do. Colton got out of the car, turned around, and said, Mommy, Daddy, I'm going in already. Maisie forced a smile. At this time, she received a text message on her cell phone. Before she had the time to take a glimpse at it, Nolan snatched the phone. What are you doing? She leaned over, wanting to grab the phone, but Quincy suddenly braked the car at that moment. which caused her leaning body to lose balance and fall into Nolan's arms. Maisie got away from his body and then glared at Quincy. "Do you know how to drive a car? We should always wait for the red light, shouldn't we?" Quincy explained softly, "Are you asking me to step on the throttle and run the red light without braking?" Nolan looked down at her and raised his eyebrows slightly. "Are you taking advantage of me?" "Hee hee, I wonder who's the person who's taking advantage." Maisie lowered her head before she could finish speaking. Her hand had ended up on a very inappropriate body part, which was extremely embarrassing. Nolan came nearer to her, his eyes full of mockery. "How does it feel?" Maisie retracted her hand, turned around, and sat back down. She did not want to be taken over, so she responded indifferently, "Not very good." Nolan did not say anything, but smiled when he saw her flushed ears. He then glanced at the screen of Maisie's phone, saw the message, and his eyes turned slightly cold. "Mr. Goldman, can you give my phone back to me already?" Maisie stretched out her hand without looking at him. "Who's the bag that you're talking about?" Nolan glanced at her gloomily. Maisie's heart skipped a beat. She snatched the cell phone from his hand and glanced at the message. "Crap, I replied to Riley's text message before going to bed last night. And this woman actually replies to me at the worst time imaginable." Looking at Nolan's murderous eyes that were about to swallow her whole, Maisie thought of something. She raised her hand, grabbed Nolan's collar, approached him, and let off a faint smile. "Dbag" is an internet term and has another meaning when used in such a context. Women would address someone as a dbag when they have a good impression of that someone. It expresses closeness. Quincy was holding back his smile, and his shoulders began to tremble. Nolan turned his head and gave him a cold glare. But he heard some commotion coming from behind while doing so. He then turned around and saw that Maisie had already opened the door of the car, had gotten out of the car, and had run away without looking back. Chapter 89. Nolan loosened his tie irritably. "It expresses closeness. She clearly didn't want to get close to me, but it doesn't matter. I'll let her adapt to the concept of being close to me slowly when she and the kids move to the Goldman mansion tomorrow." Stephen had not embarrassed Willow anymore ever since she entered the hospital due to the cut. Nonetheless, thinking of the 2 slaps that she had gotten from her father, Willow still put the blame on Maisie. Willie. Layla entered the ward hurriedly and smiled excitedly. It's trending now." "What is trending now?" Willow bit the nail of her thumb, feeling very upset. "Oh, those jewels that designer Freddie designed for Vena have gone viral on the internet." "What?" Willow was stunned. "They've gone viral?" "Yes. Your father has answered several calls asking for collaboration." After Layla finished speaking, she said triumphantly, "Maisie is not the only jewelry designer in this world. Now that Freddie's design is popular, what should we still worry about, by the way? Your father had told the old woman of the Vanderbilts about this. That old woman had always looked down upon us mother and daughter before this, but she's saying that she wants to come and pay you a visit now." "She wants to see me?" "Yes, Willie. The status of the both of us in the Vanderbilts was not as prestigious as that slut's before this, but if you can succeed with Freddie's design, you might be able to bring your position in the Vanderbilts a step further in the future." Layla had laid out the plan for her. Still, Willow was not satisfied. She wanted something more than what the Vanderbilts could offer. She wanted to be Mrs. Goldman. Wait a minute, an idea flashed through her mind. If I can surprise the jewelry field with Freddie's designs, and if Freddie is willing to become my ghost designer, won't I still have the opportunity to one-up on that bitch as long as the designs become popular? That will definitely encourage Nolan's attention. Vena Jewelry had just launched a new design, and it had become popular all over the internet. It was all due to the elegance of the Victorian era that the gothic dark vintage snake-shaped diamond necklace and earrings exuded, and the cold and enigmatic beauty that its dark temperament gave off. The creation of a ring the size of a dove egg was even more novel. The ring looked like 2 hands that were wrapped around the diamond as if they were holding it like a heart. Its design was unforgettable. Hashtag men in love. I've always thought that the Gothic style is weird, and I couldn't appreciate it. But I think I love it after seeing these masterpieces. Hashtag lady within. The Gothic style design is really great. I hope Vena can launch more great designs just like these. Maisie glanced at the tablet, and the corners of her lips were slightly raised. Kennedy walked in from outside the office and smiled. Z. The designs you gave Vena are on fire now. Vena Jewelry, who has been silent for years, can now be regarded as revitalized already. Kennedy's phone started vibrating as soon as he finished saying so. He looked down at the message and gave off a surprised expression. Uncle Kennedy. What's the matter? Willow wants to pay Freddie $1,500,000 to get him to be her ghost designer. She actually wants to use this method to gather fame. Maisie scoffed. Then let her take the bait. Since she's always wanted to get into the jewelry field so much, I should lend her a helping hand. At this time, in the Vanderbilt manor, after Layla brought Willow home, Stephen was sitting on the couch, chatting with Madame Vanderbilt. Stephen hurriedly got up and beckoned Willow to go over. Your grandmother has come to see you. Why are you still standing over there? Willow smiled and walked up to her. Grandma. Madame Vanderbilt took a glance at her. I haven't seen you for a few years, and you've grown a little more attractive. I heard your father say that Vena's newly launched jewelry is popular right now, and you're the brain behind it. It seems that I've underestimated you. Chapter 90. Mother, Willie is doing so for the Vanderbilts. Layla smiled, trying to make Madame Vanderbilt feel satisfied with herself and her daughter. Everyone knew that Madame Vanderbilt had always valued a grandson more. If it weren't for the fact that Stephen did not have any son, Madame Vanderbilt would not even bother to care about the mother and daughter pair. Madame Vanderbilt had two sons, one was Stephen, and the other was Yorick. Yorick was Stephen's elder brother who lived in the ancestral mansion of the Vanderbilts because he had given birth to a grandson for Mr. Vanderbilt Sr. Madame Vanderbilt had always attached great importance to this eldest son. If it weren't for the improvement that Vena was showing right now, Madame Vanderbilt would never come to the Basberg in person. This might be good for the Vanderbilts, but after all, she's not a man, son. In any case, the family business has to be inherited by a man. This daughter will eventually become the daughter of another family once she gets married to a man. Stephen and Layla's expressions looked extremely awkward after listening to Madame Vanderbilt's words. It's better to hand Vena to your nephew, Hector. Hector is now 23 years old and is the only heir of the Vanderbilts. When Layla heard that Madame Vanderbilt was going to hand Vena to that son of a bitch, how could she be reconciled with that idea? Mother, you might not know this, but Willie is the one who convinced this designer Freddie to collaborate with Vena. In other words, Freddie is willing to collaborate with us only because he knows about the relationship between Willie and Mr. Goldman. Stephen frowned. What does this have to do with Mr. Goldman? Layla explained with a smile, Dear, don't you know, the other day when Freddie went to Vena to talk to Willie about the collaboration, he told Willie that he knew about her only because of Mr. Goldman. The person that you're talking about. Which Mr. Goldman are you referring to? The name seemed familiar to Madame Vanderbilt. Layla looked at her. Of course it's Mr. Goldman of the Black Gold Group. Madame Vanderbilt was astounded. She then gazed at Willow with a straight eye. Wow. Young lady, you're quite capable. You actually managed to win the heart of the young Goldman. Now tell me more about this Mr. Goldman. I heard that he's extremely prestigious and influential. It would be an honor to the Vanderbilts if we could get into wedlock with the Goldmans. Layla knew that mentioning Mr. Goldman would definitely be useful. The originally tense relationship between her and her mother-in-law had finally eased up, and they could even discuss Mr. Goldman now. Stephen, who was sitting at the side, got up and left with a gloomy expression. Madame Vanderbilt could not care less about him. She thought of something and then looked at Willow. Willie, since you have such a good relationship with Mr. Goldman, you should know all the rich and influential entrepreneurs who surround Mr. Goldman. If you do introduce one of them to your cousin, Linda. Seeing that the old woman had even changed the way she addressed her, Willow was somewhat satisfied. Don't worry about that, Grandma. Humph, compared to Maisie, Linda is just a foolish and unruly girl. But it's great that she's the dumb one. She is now the person that I need the most. It would be great if I can use Linda and deal with that bitch with her. That's nice to hear. You're definitely worthy of being one of the Vanderbilts. Then I'll ask your cousin to come over tomorrow. Madame Vanderbilt was certainly happy to see that Willow was willing to help her cousin out. At noon, Maisie flipped through the list of ingredients. Xander sighed helplessly. Ms. Vanderbilt, Jade Mountain Company, is facing a shortage of rare rough stones. We can't purchase rough stones like aquamarine, tanzanite, golden emerald, black opal, and topaz from them. Maisie closed the list and looked up. Aquamarine and golden emerald, we can order those from Millennial Gemstone Incorporated. The price that they can offer is more or less similar to Jade Mountain Company. As for the black opal and tanzanite, only Taylor Jewelry has them.